What up, AP World? Welcome back. So, I understand that I have to move a little bit quicker through this information so that we don't get bogged down. So, we're going to look at China, then we're going to end with Japan. All right. So, we're going to start with the Qing Dynasty. All right. So, when we look at the Qing, really what we have to understand here is this is like the dynasty after the Ming. And remember, the Ming Dynasty had been ethnically Chinese. The Qing Dynasty are Manchurians. All right, so they've come down from Manchuria and have taken over China after the Ming Empire has been pushed out. Okay, so some keys or things that we want to really kind of focus on here is look at some of the other issues that they're going to deal with that are similar to like the Ottomans in Russia, for example. And so one thing that pops out to me is how ethnically diverse the Chinese Empire is going to be, right? They control a lot of different areas, places that speak different languages, have different ethnic origins, traditions, religions, and so it's tough to have that like one size fits all approach between them, right? So what happens is this: China in the Ming Dynasty. I don't know if you remember this. We talked about Admiral Zheng He, and Zheng He had this idea of sailing around and flexing the might of the Ming and showing off Chinese power. And look at my head flying around. Sorry, I'm such a child. After the voyages in the kind of like early 1400s, though, China really tried to close the door and hide in a bit. Right? They destroyed records, and they didn't really want much to do with the outside world other than trade, but they only wanted to do it for silver. And so that's where we see this first point kind of come in. In 1759, they pass like a law that requires Europeans, specifically the British, to only trade in the city of Guangzhou. And so what that does is it limits Europe to only one little spot where they can trade. It's easy for the Chinese government to control. They require silver. They force these foreign merchants to use these kohongs. And so it's a very bureaucratic, slow, Chinese dominated system. Okay. The British have a sneaky little plan. And what they know is that the kids like the dope, bro. And so at this moment, opium was globally a pretty big deal, the opioid crisis 1.0. And so the British do like one of the dirtiest possible things that you can do. They get as many Chinese people hooked out, strung out on opium as possible because they knew that addicts would pay money. And what do the Chinese have? Silver. And so, in some weird silver osmosis, by turning the Chinese into opium junkies, we could suck the silver out of China to then use the silver to buy the luxury goods that we want anyway. And so opium became literally the gateway drug. It's not a gateway drug. It was the gateway drug to get see what I did there? To get the goods from China. All right, and they knew what they were doing. It was horribly illegal in both England and China, and it didn't matter. So China said, whoa, hop off, bro. And the British are like, fight me, bro. And so away they went. So China writes some letters to the English government. They say, stop doing this. You're ruining trade alliances between our two countries. We really hate this. Eventually, Britain says, you can't tell us what to do. And so a series of wars known as the Opium Wars are fought, and they are completely one-sided. The British absolutely dominate during the Opium Wars. They have such a huge, successful navy. Technologically, they're way more advanced. And so imagine British steamships, powering around in the harbors, going up Chinese rivers. And meanwhile, the Chinese are still like hoisting the sails on their junks and rowing boats on the river. They were outclassed. And then the British line up in the port cities, mow people down with their muskets. And so, I mean, it's completely one-way traffic. And so they issued something known as the Unequal Treaties, specifically the Treaty of Nanjing was the big one that issued Britain all of the rights to basically just dominate China any way they wanted to. And so when we look at it, other European nations, not included in the Treaty of Nanjing, make their own treaties. And so by the time we get out of like the 1840s, China's experiencing pretty much European control. Christian missionaries are all over China. the British and other Europeans are able to do trade without paying, taxes. They have a large military presence, and so really China becomes a puppet state. Well, I shouldn't say that, but like the regions are puppets. They're what they call spheres of influence. We'll get to that in a second. In response, then, we're going to see a whole bunch of rebellions in China, right? China for like the next 60 years is just going to go off in constant rebellions. So we have a bunch. I'm not going to focus really on all of them in great specific detail. We'll kind of pick and choose some of the highlights as we go. So the Taiping rebellion really focused on a much more radical course of action than even like basic liberal enlightened philosophy. I mean, this was getting to the point of like no private property, shared wealth, mandatory education. They wanted to see an end to the dynastic rule in China. It's pretty hardcore. And eventually, the Chinese and their landed nobility band together and end this thing because it was so radical that it would have been the destruction of the complete normal order. The self-strengthening movement, again, was a very radical attempt by people inside the government to industrialize, to modernize, to try to catch up to those European nations that were beating them up. It horribly failed, and it actually kind of cut off their own agricultural success and focus, and so it ultimately was a failure. Now, this time is often referred to as the age of imperialism, and we look at it as the spheres of influence. And what I mean by that is China is really starting to be cut up into like little zones of European occupation. So the British have their 5 ports, right? And then the Germans have their trade ports, and the Russians have their trade ports, right? And the French have their trade ports. And so when we kind of look at it, each European or foreign nation is trying to hack out pieces of influence. And so if we look at like the Chinese coastline here, right, we can notice all the different countries claiming a sphere of influence. And so I just threw this like little cartoon on here. Stop it, you pig. This little cartoon on here, and of course you can't see it down here, but another sick man. So here's the Ottoman Empire, which was viewed as like one of the sick and dying empires, and he's kind of making fun of China, saying, "You don't look too good either, China. You look like you're pretty sick, also." Okay, and then so China experiences stuff like the Boxer Rebellion. And eventually, by the beginning of the Great War, China's government collapses, and we get into modern restructuring. We'll get more to that maybe later in the year. All right, so the last focus is Japan. So Japan, we also talked about them a while ago. If we go back to like the Middle Ages and kind of like those earlier kind of old regime structures, Japan had a very feudal system. Remember, we had said that the emperor had basically been replaced by a shogunate, and he had all of his daimyo and his samurai class, and so it was much more of this shogun mentality than it was an emperor. And so Japan was experiencing some very real problems, though, at this time. They had famine, agricultural failure, and because of that, shortages of products hit very hard. Taxes had to be raised, and so common people were really struggling. And even the samurai class, right, was really starting to feel the pinch, running up high debts. And so the Tokugawa shogunate had this idea that, like, well, we got to do some major reforms to try to fix the problem. And so they tried to cancel the debts. They tried to stop private merchant guilds so that the nation could make more money. They tried to get people out of the cities and back into the countryside to make more of like just the basics for survival, like rice. All of it ended up proving to be quite a failure, right? And Japan had this almost hopeless feeling of falling kind of further and further behind. And not only further behind, but like also kind of, what do you want to say, imploding even to themselves. Now, here's the pivotal moment. Here's where it all kind of changes. 1853, the Americans show up. America! Right? And we do what we like. We shoot our guns off. And so we basically do a big old, like, flex in Tokyo Harbor. We show off our ships. We show off our cannons and technology. And the Japanese understand right then and there they're in no power, no place to resist. And so America projects its desires onto Japan. The Treaty of Kanagawa, very straightforward. It basically just says that the imperial nations like America right, have the ability to dictate their terms for business inside of Japan. And so the people were frustrated. And so Japan, internally, a lot of Japanese people start to recognize, my God, we're so far behind. We need to modernize us. We're going to be taken over. Like these Europeans and Americans will literally take over our nation. And so a series of rebellions take place to get rid of the Tokugawa shogunate and instead restore the emperor. So that's why they call it the Meiji Restoration. They're restoring the Meiji, the divine one, right? The selected holy emperor. And so they restore the emperor and his family to power. And his guiding philosophy, Mitsuhito of the Meiji, his idea was this rich country, strong army. And basically what he did is he looked at Europeans and how did they become successful? How did China fail? Why did they not work out? And so how can we avoid that? And so what they came up with a plan is, let's kind of rip off Europe's own techniques. We'll do it, and in doing so, we'll compete with the Europeans, and that's exactly what they do. So they use technology and education. They send specialists and students across the globe to steal new ideas, and what they do is they build a modern army and a modern navy. They educate their people. They create railroads and telegraphs and all the other signs of modernity. And so Japan rapidly industrializes at this time. And so when we really look at it, like what are the kind of the hallmarks of the Meiji reforms then? I mean, this is going right back to the Enlightenment, to the French Revolution, and to my boy, my sweetheart, Napoleon. But these are all the things that Napoleon really strove for. I shouldn't say all, but many of these, right? The lycée system in France, where they created a school system, they do that here. Modernizing the Navy and the Army. I mean, who's better at war than Napoleon, right? A written constitution, reforms of government. He rewrote the law code, right? I mean, we had the Napoleonic Code. They rewrite their law code. The Bank of France, they have the Bank of Japan, a modern banking system. So when you look at it, what they did is they really went to the playbook of success. What made Napoleon fantastic? What made some of these European nations fantastic? Copy, paste, and then they tried it themselves, and it worked. Now, it wasn't flawless. People resisted. It was labor intensive. Common people had to toil and suffer just like European workers toiled and suffered. But I always think of it this way. In Japan, can you imagine that generation? If you were alive in the 1860s and you made it to old age, you would have witnessed Japan transform itself from a samurai-led shogunate that was horribly backwards, with people riding around on horses and cultivating rice. And maybe by your old age, you would have witnessed the largest navy in the Pacific, Japan taking over parts of China, Korea. They had defeated Russia in a war, and they almost beat America in a world war. And they witnessed, sadly, the usage of nuclear weapons, atomic weapons, on their own soil by an enemy. I mean, that's a pretty impressive life, going from medieval feudalism to the modern age. Right? So some Meiji reforms. Right? Next time we'll focus more on imperialism and how Europe and America was projecting their power, what they wanted, and how they got it across the world. All right, thanks, and stay safe, guys. Take care.